The wind cut through Cedar Lane like a knife. Broken streetlights flickered overhead, struggling to pierce the early winter darkness. Malik Jefferson huddled close to a small fire he'd managed to coax from some scattered cardboard and dry wood. His coat, worn and threadbare, did little to shield him from the biting cold. Snow had begun to fall, coating the cracked sidewalks and rusted fences in a thin white layer. Every breath he took left a ghost in the frigid air. Malik wasn't new to nights like this. He had grown accustomed to them over the past 2 years. The streets of Brooksville, Ohio, were not kind, especially to someone like him, a black man alone, past the age where most people expected him to have a home, a steady job, a life that made sense. People walked past, their eyes glancing at him for a second or two, maybe wondering what he'd done wrong. Or maybe not even that. Most people didn't notice. Most people didn't care. Yet despite it all, Malik had a presence about him, a quiet dignity that even the harshest nights couldn't erase. He moved with a calm precision, every gesture measured, almost military in its discipline. His mind wasn't just surviving the street, it was analyzing, planning, calculating. He'd learned long ago that rash moves got you hurt. Quick thinking kept you alive. And his thinking, even now, was always sharp. From across the street, the faint glow of a patrol car cut through the dark. The tires crunched on the snowy asphalt as it slowed, engine idling. Malik's eyes, dark and alert, caught the movement immediately. He did not flinch, did not move. He had learned long ago that fear could be mistaken for guilt. He stayed still, as if he were just another shadow in Cedar Lane. Inside the car, Officer Daniel Harrington scanned the street. His eyes, sharp but narrow, caught Malik's figure near the fire. Harrington's jaw tightened. To him, this was a man who didn't belong, a man who looked dangerous even though he was alone. Harrington had spent his career seeing people like Malik as problems, as threats to the order he believed he was sworn to maintain. "Looks like trouble," Harrington muttered to himself. His hand hovered near the door handle. "We've been getting complaints about this block. Time to make it right." Malik noticed the car's headlights sweeping over him. He did not panic. He had faced real danger before, real chaos, and this was nothing compared to it. He understood the world in ways most people didn't, ways that came from surviving on the streets and surviving wars he could barely talk about. He simply observed. The patrol car rolled closer, stopping a few feet away. Harrington stepped out, boots crunching on the icy pavement. His gaze was hard, probing. He looked at Malik with a judgment that had nothing to do with who Malik was as a person. It was pure assumption, a quick mental verdict built on bias, upbringing, and fear. "Evening," Harrington said curtly, his tone leaving no room for small talk. "What are you doing here?" Malik looked up, his eyes calm and steady. "Just staying warm," he said softly. His voice carried a quiet authority, not loud, not aggressive, just precise. Harrington's eyes narrowed. Something about the way Malik spoke didn't fit the story he'd already made in his mind, but he ignored it. "This block has been getting complaints. People don't want loiterers. You're coming with me?" Malik did not resist. He simply nodded, knowing resistance could turn a bad situation worse. Every muscle in his body was ready, trained to respond if necessary, but there was no need. He followed Harrington to the patrol car, the snow crunching underfoot. As he sat in the back seat, Malik's mind drifted briefly to his past. Not to the streets of Brooksville, but to a very different place. A war-torn country thousands of miles away, where he had walked through fire and smoke to save lives, where he had earned medals and praise, where he had been someone of importance. Here on Cedar Lane he was invisible. Here he was another statistic, another face of what society had overlooked. Harrington drove in silence, the occasional hum of the engine filling the car. Malik kept his eyes forward, unflinching. He had learned the hard way that any sign of fear could be used against you. This man sitting in the front seat staring into the rearview mirror was not going to see the truth of who Malik really was. At least not yet. Meanwhile, across town, Sergeant Rosa Vega was at the precinct, sipping lukewarm coffee and scanning her reports. She noticed the call come in for a loitering arrest on Cedar Lane. Something about the call caught her attention, though she couldn't immediately explain why. Experience told her to pay attention to people like Malik Jefferson, the ones others dismissed without a thought. By the time Harrington arrived at the precinct, the temperature had dropped even further. Malik was led inside, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the shiny floors, making the room feel colder than it already was. Harrington tossed the paperwork on the desk, barely acknowledging the man in front of him. Malik remained calm, his composure unshaken. He had faced worse than bureaucratic indifference. Sergeant Vega watched from a distance, her intuition prickling. There was something different about this man. His posture, his eyes, the way he observed without flinching, it spoke of training, discipline, and something more. She made a mental note to look closer, to check his identification thoroughly. Malik was booked quickly, with minimal conversation, a routine procedure for Harrington. And yet, in that routine, a silent storm was brewing. Outside the precinct, the city slept, unaware that a moment of injustice was unfolding that would eventually unravel far more than anyone could imagine. Malik sat on the bench in the holding area, the cold metal beneath him biting at his skin. He looked around, noting every detail, the officers moving about, the creak of doors, the quiet chatter, the way some officers' eyes lingered on him just a fraction too long. He had learned to read people this way, to see intentions in glances and gestures. Harrington returned to the desk, reviewing the paperwork. His mind wandered briefly, considering the complaints he'd received earlier. This wasn't just a black man on the streets. This was a problem that needed correcting in his view. He didn't yet know that the person sitting quietly behind him was someone who had faced real danger, who had saved lives, who had been recognized for heroism that mattered far more than petty neighborhood complaints. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Cedar Lane was quiet, but in the silence lay the tension of stories untold, of truths hidden beneath assumptions and prejudice. And in that tension, Malik Jefferson waited, patient, observant, ready for the moment when the world would finally see him for what he was. Not just a homeless man, not just another face on the street, but a hero whose life had been dismissed until now. If this is your first time on TopCore, hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you real American stories, raw emotions, and lessons that matter. Don't miss out on the journey that will reveal truths society often ignores. And even as the night closed in, one thing was certain. The story of Malik Jefferson had just begun, and the streets of Brooksville were about to bear witness to a truth that no prejudice could erase. Daniel Harrington drove the patrol car back toward the precinct, the heater doing little to keep the chill out. He glanced at Malik once more through the rearview mirror, and something about the man's composure unsettled him. There was no fear, no hesitation, just a quiet, almost calculated calm that made Harrington uncomfortable. Harrington had always believed he knew people at a glance. Growing up in a white suburb of Brooksville, he had learned early that rules were to be followed, that people who stepped outside their expected roles were dangerous. His father, a police captain, had drilled the same lessons into him. Obedience, order, and control were the pillars of life. Anything else was suspect. This was the lens through which Harrington saw the world. And tonight, it painted Malik Jefferson as a problem, a man who had no right to be on Cedar Lane, whose presence was an insult to the order Harrington believed he was sworn to protect. Inside the car, Harrington's thoughts wandered briefly to his own life. He had graduated high school, joined the police academy, and risen quickly through the ranks. People respected him, or feared him. That was the way things were supposed to be. And yet every time he arrested someone like Malik, there was an uneasy tension, a nagging feeling that he didn't fully understand the people he policed. He pushed it aside. Rules were rules, and tonight, Malik Jefferson had broken one. Malik, sitting silently behind him, watched the city pass by in slow, jagged frames of neon light and snow-dusted asphalt. Harrington didn't know that Malik had faced situations far more dangerous than a winter night in Brooksville. 2 tours overseas, bullets whizzing past, lives hanging by threads. Malik had been someone others depended on, someone trained to think, react, survive. And yet here he was, treated like a common criminal. As the car pulled into the precinct parking lot, Harrington parked and stepped out, his boots crunching against the icy ground. The door to the holding area opened, and Malik followed without resistance, his eyes scanning the room, noting the positions of officers and the small details that others overlooked. Inside, the fluorescent lights reflected off the polished floor, making the room feel sterile and cold. Harrington directed Malik to a bench, the paperwork already in his hand. Every motion Harrington made was precise, authoritative, meant to assert control. Malik simply watched, waiting, patient, unbothered. Harrington couldn't understand it. How could a man who looked like this, thin, ragged, homeless, possess a calm that unnerved him? Every instinct told Harrington to assert dominance, to make this man acknowledge the system. And yet, Malik's silence, his composure, disrupted the certainty Harrington relied on. Sergeant Rosa Vega entered the room, observing quietly from a distance. She noted the tension in Harrington's posture, the rigid set of his jaw, and the way his eyes lingered on Malik longer than necessary. She didn't intervene yet. Experience told her this was a situation that would reveal much if handled carefully. Harrington handed over the forms for booking, barely glancing at Malik's identification. Malik's Army ID and documentation lay on the desk, partially obscured. Harrington's mind processed it only briefly. Another piece of paper, another line of procedure. It didn't register. It wouldn't register until later. Malik leaned back slightly, the cold metal of the bench biting at him, and thought about the irony. He had risked his life for a country that now turned its back on him. And here he was, judged for existing in a neighborhood where the color of his skin made him a target. But Malik's face betrayed nothing. Calm, steady, observant, the hours passed slowly. Harrington completed the paperwork, barely acknowledging Malik, while other officers went about their routines. The world outside the precinct carried on, unaware that a moment of injustice had taken place that night. One arrest, one judgment, one assumption, and yet it was about to ripple far beyond this room. Even as Malik sat quietly, the fire of his past life burned within him. He knew his story was bigger than this moment, bigger than the streets, bigger than the judgment of one man. And though Harrington couldn't see it yet, the truth would not stay hidden forever. The tension in the room thickened. Harrington, confident in his authority, did not realize how fragile his certainty was. Malik Jefferson, the man behind him, was no ordinary citizen. And tonight, the first seeds of confrontation between prejudice and truth had been planted. Malik's past remains hidden, Harrington unaware. But come to think of it, what will happen when the truth begins to surface? Malik Jefferson had learned early on that life didn't give second chances easily. Growing up in the suburbs of Cincinnati, Ohio, he had been a bright kid, the kind who noticed patterns in the world that others missed. He could fix anything mechanical, think through problems strategically, and even in grade school, he had a sense of responsibility that often made teachers and neighbors take notice. But talent and intelligence didn't guarantee fairness. Malik's family, though loving, had struggled against systemic barriers and societal prejudice. From being overlooked for scholarships to being treated with suspicion in stores or on school trips, he quickly realized that the color of his skin often mattered more than his effort or his skill. Every minor success came with the invisible weight of proving himself repeatedly, of being twice as good to be seen as equal. Even as a child, Malik's grandfather had instilled in him a sense of dignity, resilience, and justice. "You can't control how people see you," his grandfather would say, voice low but firm. "But you can control who you are when they try to diminish you." Those words became a lifeline. They shaped how Malik approached every challenge, every slight, every setback he would face. By the time he was a teenager, Malik had already decided that he would serve something bigger than himself. At 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. It was a choice fueled not by adventure, but by purpose. He wanted to protect others, to fight for people who couldn't defend themselves. He wanted to be part of something that mattered. Military life was rigorous, unyielding, and it suited him. Malik thrived on structure, discipline, and the clarity of mission. His superiors noticed his sharp intellect and calm under pressure, qualities that would earn him accolades and respect in the field. 2 tours in Afghanistan followed, each leaving marks visible and invisible. He led soldiers through dangerous missions, saved civilians, and often had to make choices that weighed morality against survival. His bravery earned him a Bronze Star, commendations for leadership, and the quiet admiration of those who served alongside him. But the battlefield was not where his struggles ended. Returning home, Malik faced an enemy he could not fight with strategy or weapons: indifference. The country that celebrated him abroad seemed to turn a blind eye to him at home. Medical bills piled up from injuries sustained in combat. PTSD haunted his nights. Employment opportunities were scarce for someone carrying physical and mental scars that weren't immediately visible. Slowly, the support network that should have been there crumbled. Friends moved away, family did what they could, and bureaucratic systems offered only frustration. Malik drifted, sometimes reluctantly, into homelessness. Cedar Lane became a new battlefield, a place where vigilance was necessary, not for survival overseas, but against hunger, cold, and judgment. And yet, he carried himself with the discipline of a soldier. Every movement, every decision was calculated for safety, for survival, for dignity. He was still a hero. The medals were in storage, the recognition faded, but the courage was still alive. Even now, sitting quietly in the precinct, Malik's mind revisited those past days. He remembered the moments in the dust and heat of distant lands, when a life could be saved or lost in seconds. He remembered the young soldiers he had mentored, the civilians whose lives depended on split-second decisions, and he remembered the stark contrast. Those victories overseas mattered to the world, but here, in Brooksville, his very existence was treated as a problem. The sound of footsteps brought Malik back to the present. Harrington was moving paperwork across the desk, glancing up occasionally with a frown that Malik had learned to read long ago. Harrington saw a homeless man, a face he had judged before even asking a question. He could not see the hero behind the clothes, behind the cold eyes that had seen fire and chaos far greater than anything he could imagine. Sergeant Vega observed quietly. She had already begun forming questions in her mind. Who was this man? Why did he carry himself with such a quiet authority? Why did her instincts tell her that Harrington's assumptions were wrong? She took mental notes. Experience had taught her that the truth often hid in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. Malik's gaze drifted toward a small window. Snow was falling more heavily now, painting Cedar Lane in white, the streets eerily silent. In the distance, faint lights flickered in the apartments and factories. The world outside continued without noticing him, without noticing the injustice of the moment. Yet Malik understood something crucial. This story wasn't over. It would not be ignored forever. Even in that holding cell in the quiet tension, there was an unspoken challenge in the air. Harrington believed he had control. The system believed it had authority. And Malik? He waited, not out of fear, but with the calm certainty of someone who had faced death and returned, someone who knew patience could shift the world in unexpected ways. And somewhere, far from the precinct, the first whispers of his story began to stir. A journalist would take note, a veteran would remember, a neighbor would see. The impact of this single night had already started to ripple, though none of them knew it yet. The tension hung thick in the room, the kind that made every second feel heavier than the last. Harrington's confidence in his judgment was strong, but cracks had begun to form, unnoticed by him. Malik Jefferson, silent and composed, waited, carrying the weight of a past no one yet recognized and a future that might finally demand acknowledgement. Malik's history is slowly surfacing, and people are left anticipating the moment it collides with Harrington's world. Malik's memories were never far away. The sounds, the sights, the decisions he had made, they came unbidden. Even a quiet precinct could trigger a flashback, a sudden noise, the way someone moved, a glance that carried hidden intent. He remembered being dropped into foreign lands, stepping off planes into chaos, and walking streets where a single misstep could end everything. He remembered Lieutenant Daniels, a mentor, telling him once, "Courage isn't about surviving. It's about doing what's right even when it costs you everything." Those words had stuck. Every medal Malik earned, every commendation, every sign of honor carried more than recognition. It carried responsibility. Yet now, sitting on a metal bench in Brooksville, that same courage felt invisible, dismissed by a society that measured worth in addresses and jobs rather than service and sacrifice. The precinct lights reflected off his Army ID, partially hidden under the blanket he had brought with him. Harrington barely glanced at it. To him it was a sheet of paper. To Malik it was a symbol of everything he had been, and everything the world had ignored. He had been someone who saved lives, someone trusted in the most extreme situations, someone whose decisions had altered the course of events. And now he was treated as a vagrant. Malik's PTSD flared briefly, a sudden memory of a firefight, bullets ripping through walls, screams in the night. His hand instinctively went to the small scar on his wrist, a souvenir of a mission gone wrong. He closed his eyes for a second, grounding himself in the present. Control, observation, patience. These were tools he relied on daily, and he relied on them now more than ever. Harrington returned to the desk, muttering about procedure and paperwork. He barely registered Malik's history. In his mind, the law was black and white. A man was loitering, rules were broken, and consequences must follow. He didn't see the irony, didn't see the injustice. Malik's calm demeanor only irritated him further. Why didn't this man appear intimidated? Why didn't he plead or flinch? Harrington's pride would not allow him to question his assumptions. Sergeant Vega, meanwhile, had begun to piece together the faint clues. The ID, the disciplined posture, the quiet authority in Malik's voice. She began mentally drafting the steps she would take to verify his story. Her instincts told her there was more here than a simple arrest. She noted Harrington's blind spots, his assumptions, and the potential for a serious mistake. Outside the precinct, snow blanketed Cedar Lane, hiding the decay and neglect under a thin layer of white. The world continued without noticing Malik's plight, but she knew that stories like his had a way of demanding attention eventually. One veteran's note, one journalist's curiosity, one moment of truth could ignite change. Malik sat silently, observing everyone and everything, aware of the power imbalance but unafraid. He had survived things that Harrington couldn't imagine. He had faced life and death decisions and emerged with his integrity intact. This, he knew, was a moment that could shift if patience and timing aligned. And then, there was the quiet knowledge that someone was watching, someone who might understand before the rest of the world did. Rosa Vega, her eyes alert from a distance, represented the first thread of recognition. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Malik it meant the tide could begin to turn. Even as Harrington busied himself with forms, Malik's thoughts wandered to the men and women he had served with, the lives saved, and the sacrifices made. Each memory carried weight. Each memory demanded respect. And yet, the system that was supposed to honor that service had forgotten him. He looked up, meeting Harrington's gaze briefly, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them, not of equality, not yet, but a silent test. Harrington's assumptions would soon be challenged. The story was far from over. Malik Jefferson had survived fire, snow, and indifference. And now, in the quiet hum of the Brooksville precinct, he waited for the moment when the truth of who he was would finally surface. The holding area smelled of antiseptic and cold metal. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, blending with the distant murmur of officers on routine duty. Malik Jefferson sat quietly on the bench, his posture straight despite the discomfort of the cold, unyielding seat. Every fiber of his being was alert, every glance, every movement, calculated. He had been trained to survive chaos, and even here, amidst bureaucracy and prejudice, he applied the same discipline. Officer Daniel Harrington walked back to the desk, shuffling papers, muttering about regulations and complaints. He glanced at Malik again and shook his head, barely concealing the irritation that the man's calm provoked. In Harrington's mind, this was a routine arrest. A homeless man sitting quietly in the precinct, yet the way Malik carried himself, measured, composed, unafraid, grated against his assumptions. "You've been here before?" Harrington asked, attempting casual conversation, though it was laced with suspicion. Malik's eyes met his. "I've been places," he said softly. No explanation, no plea, just a simple statement that carried weight in its calmness. Harrington frowned, frustrated. "Places don't matter. You broke the law." Malik's expression remained unchanged. "I broke no one's life, only sat where I could survive the night." His words were careful, neutral, yet they struck a nerve. Harrington wasn't used to this kind of honesty or composure from someone he considered beneath him. Across the room, Sergeant Rosa Vega noticed the subtle tension. Harrington's impatience and snap judgments were clear to anyone watching. She took a step closer, her instincts pushing her to observe more carefully. Something about Malik Jefferson was not ordinary. The quiet confidence, the way he studied the room, the precision of his movements. It was familiar to her from years of law enforcement and experience in crisis situations. Harrington, meanwhile, had begun documenting the arrest. Name, age, address, if you could call the streets of Cedar Lane an address. Paperwork was routine, familiar, a shield from the discomfort of the unknown. But Malik made him uneasy, and that unease simmered beneath his rigid professionalism. Malik shifted slightly, hands resting on his knees. He noticed the glances of other officers, fleeting and often judgmental. He didn't flinch. Every time someone underestimated him, it reminded him why he had survived wars, why he had returned home, and why he had to endure nights like this. "You got ID?" Harrington asked abruptly, his tone sharper now. Malik produced a folded wallet, revealing an Army ID and a few documents, partially worn from years of handling. Harrington barely glanced at them, filing them as a routine identification. He didn't understand the significance. He saw paper. Malik had lived lives others only read about in headlines. Vega's eyes narrowed. She noticed the medals on the documents, faint but visible. The handwriting on commendation letters, the military stamps. There was more to Malik than Harrington realized. She made a mental note to follow up. Her curiosity wasn't just professional, it was moral. Malik leaned back on the bench, observing Harrington as he worked. The younger officer was confident in his authority, certain that Malik was nothing more than a statistic, another arrest in a city struggling with crime and social decay. But confidence without understanding, Malik knew, could be dangerous, for the person wielding it and for the one being judged. Minutes passed, each stretching longer than the last. Harrington's fingers typed mechanically, the hum of the keyboard blending with the low voices of officers walking by. Malik remained motionless, still, almost meditative, his mind replaying fragments of distant wars, streets that were bullets and dust, missions where lives depended on him alone. Those experiences had honed him into someone who could endure far worse than cold floors and dismissive authority. Harrington paused, glancing over documents, and something about the handwriting or the folds of paper caught his eye. He squinted but dismissed it quickly, uninterested. To him, it didn't matter. He had made a decision. The law had been broken. Case closed. Malik's lips pressed into a thin line, holding back the urge to comment, to explain, to plead. Silence was his weapon here. Silence demanded recognition, even if it wasn't immediately given. Harrington didn't realize that every second he underestimated Malik only built the tension, only drew attention to the disparity between perception and reality. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the city's usual clamor. The quiet was deceptive. It mirrored the calm before an inevitable storm. Sergeant Vega, still observing, finally approached Harrington's desk. "Mind if I check something?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Harrington hesitated, unsure if he should allow interference, but nodded. She examined Malik's documents more closely, her eyes widening slightly as recognition dawned. Malik's calm gaze never left the room, never left Harrington. Inside him, he carried the patience of a soldier and the expectation that truth had its own timing. Outside, the world was blind. Inside, the tension between prejudice and reality had reached a quiet standoff, each side unaware of the storm about to break. Harrington's fingers drummed the desk. "Everything looks routine," he muttered, though his voice carried uncertainty now. Something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable. Malik had revealed nothing, yet everything about him demanded acknowledgement. Vega stepped back, weighing her options. She could see the hidden depth of Malik's life, and she knew that Harrington's assumptions were flawed. But revealing it now could upend the system, challenge authority, and expose uncomfortable truths. Her instincts screamed that this was just the beginning. Malik shifted slightly on the bench, one leg crossed over the other, his eyes sweeping the room. He had faced more dangerous situations than this, but he understood that this encounter, this microcosm of societal bias, could be just as deadly in its own way. Survival here required different skills: patience, observation, subtle influence, and above all, understanding the human psychology of those who underestimated him. Harrington's world was orderly, predictable, and defined by rules and routines. Malik's world, shaped by war, survival, and societal neglect, had trained him for unpredictability. The collision between these two worlds was inevitable, and both were about to learn lessons they could not yet predict. The precinct's clock ticked loudly. Officers moved past, indifferent. Harrington, focused on procedure, failed to notice the weight of what was sitting quietly before him. A man whose courage had once altered the course of life and death, now challenged by assumptions and prejudice. Malik's eyes shifted to the door for a brief moment, then back to Harrington. Patience, strategy, and dignity were his allies. Harrington, pride and bias, his. The room was silent, tense, the kind of silence that holds consequences heavier than words. And in that quiet, the audience feels the tension building, waiting for the moment when reality will collide with judgment. The question hangs in the air. How long can assumptions go unchallenged before truth demands recognition? Malik's heroism is hinted at, Vega begins piecing things together, and Harrington remains unaware of the storm about to hit. The fluorescent lights hummed over the precinct, casting a stark glare that highlighted every crease, every line of worry or tension on the faces of the officers. Malik Jefferson remained seated on the metal bench, his posture unchanged, his eyes calm but alert. Every detail mattered: the shift of a foot, the tone of a voice, the quiet shuffle of paperwork. It was all data, and Malik absorbed it without appearing tense. Officer Harrington continued his paperwork at the front desk. To him, this was just another arrest, routine and expected. A black man, a complaint about loitering, the system moving in its usual mechanical way. But every glance he cast at Malik carried a tension he didn't yet recognize. The man in front of him was not ordinary, not by a long shot. And that unsettled him. Malik's mind wandered briefly back to moments that had shaped him. Gunfire and dust, decisions that weighed lives in seconds, and nights where silence was a survival skill. The world had once recognized him, praised him, celebrated him. Now it barely acknowledged his existence, dismissing him as part of the background of a neglected city. The contrast was bitter, almost ironic. Sergeant Vega stepped closer again, her curiosity growing with every passing minute. She leaned slightly over Harrington's desk, scanning Malik's documents. Her eyes caught the faint medals and commendations, the carefully written certificates of valor. She could see the outline of a story that Harrington was blind to, a life of courage, service, and sacrifice. Harrington, oblivious, continued filling out forms. Name, address, crime, signature. His focus was on procedure, not reality. The world of rules and paperwork was where he felt control. And yet, the more he ignored the signs, the more tension built in the room. Malik shifted his weight slightly, not out of discomfort but awareness. He noticed the subtle shift in Vega's posture, the quiet recognition in her eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak. Observation was his weapon. Knowledge was his armor. Patience, his strategy. Minutes dragged on. Harrington muttered complaints about slow systems and insufficient documentation. His pride was beginning to fray, though he refused to acknowledge it. This man, sitting silently, seemed immune to intimidation, immune to fear, immune to the rules Harrington used to measure people. The tension between assumption and truth grew, almost visible in the stale air of the precinct. Vega finally spoke, her voice low, careful. "You might want to double-check his identification." Harrington barely glanced. "It's fine," he said. But something had shifted. Unbeknownst to him, the first crack in his certainty had appeared. Malik's eyes shifted to the window, snow falling outside, covering the cracked streets, the forgotten alleys, and the lives of people who, like him, struggled to be seen. He had survived more dangerous moments than this, and yet he understood that human prejudice could wound in ways bullets never could. Vega quietly stepped back, deciding to handle things carefully. The story of Malik Jefferson was not a simple one, and she knew exposing it at the wrong time could trigger backlash. But watching Harrington, seeing his blind spots, she knew patience was key. The revelation, when it came, needed to be undeniable. Malik leaned slightly forward on the bench, eyes fixed on a small crack in the floor. Observation, patience, and control. He had mastered them in war and in life. Harrington, on the other hand, relied on assumptions, pride, and routine. The collision of these approaches was inevitable. Outside, the snowstorm thickened. Brooksville slept, unaware that in a small precinct the quiet friction of prejudice and truth was building toward a reckoning. The officers moved around them, oblivious to the storm that Malik carried silently within himself, and in that moment, the audience feels the weight of injustice, tension, and anticipation. Malik's past is slowly being uncovered, the truth inching closer, and Harrington remains blind, confident in his authority, unaware that the foundation of his assumptions is about to shake. Malik's heroism is still hidden, Vega's curiosity deepens, and the storm of recognition, revelation, and confrontation is quietly approaching. Eleanor Whitman had a nose for stories that others overlooked. Her job at the Brooksville Gazette wasn't just reporting events. It was uncovering truths the city tried to hide. When she heard about the arrest of a homeless black man on Cedar Lane, something clicked. It wasn't the routine nature of the arrest. It was the way whispers about the incident hinted at injustice. Eleanor didn't know why yet, but her instincts screamed that this story mattered. The streets of Cedar Lane were silent in the early morning, snow still drifting from the previous night. Eleanor parked her car a few blocks away and walked slowly, notebook in hand, scanning the area. Broken streetlights, boarded-up windows, and faint graffiti told a story of neglect, poverty, and inequality. But it was the people, or the lack of attention to them, that caught her eye. The same society that overlooked this street overlooked lives like Malik Jefferson's. Back at the precinct, Eleanor had already called in, asking for comment on the arrest. She got the standard bureaucratic response: loitering, vagrancy, routine arrest. But something in her gut told her that wasn't the whole story. She decided to dig deeper, to follow the threads others ignored. Malik sat quietly in the holding area, unaware that a journalist was beginning to trace his steps. He had learned to survive by noticing those who observed and those who judged. And Eleanor's approach, careful, curious, methodical, was the kind that could pierce the veil of indifference. Harrington remained focused on routine paperwork, his assumptions unchallenged. To him, the situation was straightforward. A homeless man arrested, procedure followed, problem solved. He didn't see the layers beneath the surface, the life that had been dismissed, the courage that went unnoticed, the injustice quietly brewing in the tension of the room. Malik's story. She had taken note of the military documents, the faint medals, the disciplined presence that spoke of past service. She could feel the shift in the energy of the room, subtle but undeniable. Something about Malik Jefferson demanded attention, and she was determined to uncover it. Eleanor's fingers danced across the keyboard, searching databases, calling old contacts, and verifying any information that could illuminate Malik's past. Hours passed. Slowly, a picture began to form. Bronze Star, commendations for leadership under fire, multiple tours overseas, recognized by military superiors for bravery and strategic skill. Each detail confirmed Eleanor's suspicion. This was no ordinary man. Back at the precinct, Harrington's impatience began to show. He had grown uncomfortable with the tension he couldn't explain. Malik's silence, Vega's quiet scrutiny, and the subtle energy in the room all unsettled him. He had spent his career feeling in control of situations like this. Yet here, his assumptions faltered. Malik leaned slightly back, observing Harrington as he worked. Every flicker of the officer's frustration was a clue. Every glance away from protocol was another hint. Malik's calm was strategic, patient, and measured. He had survived wars where chaos ruled, and here, in a room of authority and judgment, he applied the same discipline. Eleanor finally tracked down contacts who had served with Malik overseas. Phone calls were made. Names were verified. Stories emerged of daring rescues, split-second decisions, and courage under fire. And now, a larger truth was forming. A decorated war hero, neglected by the very country he served, had been arrested for merely existing on a street he had once walked past unnoticed. The tension between Harrington's assumptions and reality thickened. Malik's past, though not yet revealed, was moving closer to the surface. Vega watched silently, knowing that the collision of truth and prejudice was approaching. Outside, Cedar Lane remained quiet, but snow continued to fall, softening the sharp edges of the street while masking the injustice hidden in plain sight. Eleanor, determined and relentless, sensed that her discovery could change the narrative, exposing both systemic failure and the courage of a man dismissed by society. And in that quiet, a spark ignited. The audience feels it. Something is about to break the status quo. Malik's life, defined by heroism abroad and neglect at home, is on the brink of revelation. Harrington's worldview is about to face a challenge he cannot ignore. Eleanor uncovers key military records. The stage is set, and Malik's hidden heroism is moments away from public exposure. Officer Daniel Harrington had always believed in order. Rules mattered, authority mattered, and people who stepped outside what he considered proper behavior were, by definition, problematic. But sitting in the precinct, watching Malik Jefferson remain calm under scrutiny, he felt unease creeping in, a discomfort he hadn't encountered often in his career. Harrington tried to rationalize it. He repeated his assumptions. A homeless man, streets like Cedar Lane, complaints filed by neighbors. The law had been applied, case closed. And yet, there was something in Malik's demeanor that refused to fit the story Harrington had written in his mind. The man's patience, his calm observation, the subtle authority in his presence. It unsettled Harrington more than he wanted to admit. Sergeant Rosa Vega approached, still holding Malik's documents. "These records need closer attention," she said quietly. "He's not just a homeless man. There's more here." Harrington barely glanced. "I've handled enough cases tonight," he muttered. But Vega's tone was firm. She wasn't asking. She was instructing. Malik, sitting silently, observed the tension growing between them. He had faced this before in different forms: authority blinded by assumptions, people judging him before seeing his truth. He didn't flinch. He had learned patience, and he had learned that revealing too much too soon could escalate danger. Silence was sometimes the greatest weapon. Vega scanned the military ID and documents again. The name, the dates, the awards. They were not minor commendations. Bronze Star, multiple tours, leadership under fire, valor recognized by superiors. It was the life Harrington had overlooked because it didn't fit his assumptions about a homeless man in a winter precinct. Harrington, meanwhile, fumed silently. He couldn't explain why he felt uneasy, why the calm in Malik's eyes made him doubt his judgment. Authority was his comfort, assumptions his shield, but now both felt fragile. Every instinct he had about control and order was being quietly challenged. Malik shifted slightly, his eyes following Vega as she quietly cross-referenced details. His life had been ignored, his service overlooked, his existence dismissed. Yet here was someone noticing, someone who understood that assumptions often hid truth. Patience had brought this recognition to the surface, and Malik was ready for the moment when the world would see him not as a problem, but as a man of courage and integrity. Outside, snow continued to blanket Cedar Lane, softening the edges of a city unaware of the storm gathering in its heart. Eleanor Whitman's investigation progressed, tracing contacts who could corroborate Malik's military history. Each phone call, each confirmation, brought the story closer to revelation. Harrington finally glanced at the documents Vega had set aside. Something about the folds, the stamps, and the faint metals caught his attention, but he pushed it aside. To acknowledge it fully would mean admitting he had been wrong, a difficult step for a man who had built his worldview on assumptions and control. Malik's past, though silent for now, was pressing forward, demanding recognition. He remembered every decision, every mission, every life saved, and every sacrifice made. And he waited, not in fear, not in anger, but in quiet anticipation for the truth to collide with the ignorance before him. Vega's curiosity deepened. She realized that exposing Malik's story would shake assumptions, challenge prejudice, and force Harrington to confront a reality he had refused to see. But timing was crucial. The revelation needed precision to have the full impact it deserved. Malik's gaze shifted to Harrington briefly. The officer's pride, confidence, and assumptions created a fragile barrier, one that, when broken, would demand a confrontation between justice and bias. Malik understood the stakes. He had survived worse. He had faced death. And now, he would endure the confrontation of truth against prejudice. The audience watching feels the tension tightening. Malik's hidden heroism is no longer a secret. The system's assumptions are fragile. Harrington's worldview is unsteady. Vega and Eleanor are positioned to reveal the truth. The stage is set for exposure, confrontation, and public reckoning. Snow fell quietly outside, masking the city's neglect. But inside the precinct, a storm was about to break. The friction between authority, prejudice, and truth reached a critical point, and Malik Jefferson, patient, observant, unflinching, was at its center. The first signs of Malik's heroism are on the brink of exposure. Harrington's assumptions are beginning to crack, people wondering how the truth will finally collide with prejudice. The news of Malik Jefferson's arrest had started to ripple beyond the precinct. Small murmurs in Cedar Lane, brief exchanges at corner stores, and the quiet attention of neighbors hinted that something unusual was unfolding. The ordinary assumption of a homeless man being a problem was already starting to crack. Eleanor Whitman had made her calls, verified the documents, and confirmed with multiple sources that Malik's military record was impeccable. Every medal, every commendation, every story of courage from Afghanistan aligned. She typed furiously, her fingers flying over the keyboard as the narrative began to take shape. A decorated war hero, abandoned by society, arrested for merely existing on the streets. This was a story that demanded attention. At the precinct, Sergeant Vega reviewed Malik's documents again, carefully noting dates, missions, and commendations. She had begun drafting an internal report, something that could both protect Malik and hold the department accountable. She wasn't naive. She knew the bureaucratic pushback would be strong. Harrington, meanwhile, continued to shuffle papers, unaware that the very truth he ignored would soon shatter his assumptions. Malik, seated on the bench, sensed the subtle shift in energy. He had survived firefights, ambushes, and life-or-death missions where seconds determined outcomes. Yet here, in a room of cold, fluorescent light and dismissive authority, the stakes were no less real. He remained calm, observing every movement, every glance, every hesitation. Patience had always been his strongest weapon. Outside, the winter wind howled through Brooksville's streets. Cedar Lane, often forgotten, became a stage for quiet injustice and the unfolding of hidden heroism. Eleanor walked past abandoned storefronts, her mind racing through every detail she had confirmed. The story wasn't just about Malik's past, it was about the way society treated those it owed the most recognition to. Every veteran, every marginalized individual, every citizen left behind by systems designed to protect them. Malik's story could become a mirror. Harrington's frustration grew quietly, a tension that no one noticed but everyone in the room could feel. He had always believed in his authority, in his judgment, in his ability to assess situations and people. Yet Malik's presence challenged that belief subtly, unnervingly, without a single confrontational word. Vega finally addressed him directly, choosing her moment carefully. "Officer Harrington, I think you need to look at his records more closely." Her voice was calm, but firm. She didn't explain yet. She allowed the curiosity to take root. Harrington glanced briefly at the documents, catching the faint outline of medals and commendations. For a fraction of a second, he paused. Something stirred inside him, a question he hadn't asked before. Could he have been wrong? Malik, noticing the shift, remained composed. His gaze was steady, patient, and quietly commanding. He had faced authority that underestimated him countless times before, and he knew this would be no different. The truth would emerge, but it would require others to see beyond their assumptions. Eleanor's article was nearly ready. She had woven together interviews, military records, and eyewitness accounts to construct a story that was both emotional and controversial. She emphasized the neglect Malik had endured, the courage he had displayed overseas, and the arrest that had exposed deep-seated prejudice in Brooksville's policing. As her story began to circulate through the newsroom, social media, and local contacts, the city started to stir. Comments, messages, and phone calls trickled in, some outraged, some sympathetic, some questioning the system entirely. Malik's past was emerging, and the world was beginning to notice. Back at the precinct, Harrington's unease grew. His assumptions, once unquestioned, were now confronted with undeniable evidence. He looked at Malik, then at Vega, and finally at the military documents. A knot of uncertainty formed in his chest. How could someone he dismissed so casually carry such honor? How had his pride and prejudice blinded him? Malik's eyes never left Harrington. Calm, observant, and patient, he understood that this moment, this slow revelation, was part of the confrontation. The truth didn't need force. It needed recognition. And recognition, when it came, had the power to upend assumptions and ignite change. The precinct remained quiet, tension thick in the air. Officers moved around, unaware of the significance of what was unfolding. The story of Malik Jefferson was no longer contained. It was beginning to seep out, slowly but irreversibly. Malik's past is on the verge of public exposure. Harrington's assumptions are cracking, and the city's perception of justice and heroism is about to be challenged. By the next morning, the Brooksville Gazette had published Eleanor Whitman's article. The headline struck like a hammer. "Homeless black man arrested in Cedar Lane is a decorated war hero." Social media immediately caught fire. Shares, comments, and discussions exploded across the city. People were shocked, outraged, and inspired, all at once. Malik Jefferson sat in the holding area, unaware of the storm building outside. The reactions wouldn't matter yet. He knew patience was crucial. The world's attention was like a wave. It could crash, or it could carry change. He remained seated, calm, composed, the quiet force of his presence commanding respect, even without anyone realizing it yet. Officer Harrington finally saw the article. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the accolades, commendations, and accounts of Malik's service. Bronze Star, tours in Afghanistan, lives saved, leadership under fire. Every sentence eroded the certainty he had held in his judgment. Every word forced him to confront a truth he had ignored for far too long. He felt a twinge of shame, a rare emotion for a man like Harrington. He had judged Malik before even speaking to him, before understanding him, before recognizing the humanity that had been hiding in plain sight. And now, the world knew, the city knew, and he couldn't unsee it. Sergeant Vega observed quietly, noting Harrington's reaction. She had expected resistance, denial, maybe even anger. But the look on his face was something else entirely. An unfamiliar confrontation with humility. It was the first crack in the wall of prejudice he had built around himself. Outside, Cedar Lane buzzed with renewed attention. Neighbors, previously indifferent, began asking questions. Community members reached out to Eleanor for interviews. Social media users debated the arrest, some criticizing the police, others questioning the societal neglect of veterans. The conversation was happening, and Malik's story was at the center. Back in the precinct, Malik remained composed. He understood the power of the moment, the inevitability of exposure. His heroism was no longer hidden. The city's perception was shifting, and Harrington had no choice but to confront reality. Harrington finally approached Malik, words catching in his throat. I didn't know, he said, barely audible. The statement was clumsy, insufficient, but it was a start. Malik's eyes met his, calm but piercing. No words were necessary. The truth had spoken for itself. Vega stepped in, her tone firm but compassionate. Recognition doesn't erase prejudice, but it can be a start, she said. Harrington nodded slowly, the weight of acknowledgement settling on him. Malik exhaled quietly, his first subtle display of emotion in the precinct. Relief, maybe, or perhaps a silent acceptance that his patience had paid off. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand validation. He simply allowed the truth to exist, knowing that it carried more weight than any confrontation could. Eleanor's article continued to circulate, spreading beyond Brooksville. Veteran groups, civil rights advocates, and community leaders took notice. Calls to support Malik and others like him began flowing in. The city, for the first time, was confronting its own biases, its neglect, and its failures. Harrington stood silently, watching Malik. The officer's worldview had shifted, at least slightly, shaken by undeniable evidence. It was a start, imperfect but real. Malik's story had forced recognition, and in that, it carried power. The audience is left with the sense of transformation, both societal and personal. The injustice, the prejudice, and the neglect were still present, but cracks were forming. The heroism of Malik Jefferson, once ignored, had found its people, and the collision between truth and prejudice had begun. Malik's heroism has been exposed publicly. Harrington begins to confront his biases, and the city of Brooksville is poised at the edge of awareness, leaving viewers eager to see the ripple effects. The city of Brooksville had woken up to a storm. Eleanor Whitman's article about Malik Jefferson spread like wildfire, igniting outrage, admiration, and deep reflection. On social media, hashtags began trending. Justice for Malik. Recognize our heroes. Brooksville Truth. Citizens shared their anger over how the system treated someone who risked his life for the country, only to be disregarded when he returned home. Inside the precinct, Officer Harrington felt eyes on him in ways he wasn't used to. Colleagues whispered behind closed doors, some in judgment, others in curiosity. His authority felt challenged, not by an individual, but by the collective attention of the public. For a man who had built his career on control and unquestioned assumptions, this was unfamiliar terrain. Sergeant Vega quietly monitored the reactions, both inside and outside the precinct. She had anticipated some backlash, some questioning, but she hadn't expected the rapidity with which the city would react. Community members began showing up at the precinct, demanding information, advocating for Malik, and questioning the procedures that led to his arrest. Malik sat quietly on the bench, observing everything with the calm patience of someone who had survived far worse. The world outside had finally begun to notice him, but he understood that recognition didn't erase injustice. It only highlighted the system's failures. He had faced prejudice before in the military and in civilian life, and he knew the fight was just beginning. Eleanor visited the precinct in person, her notebook in hand, ready to speak to anyone willing to comment. She approached Malik cautiously, sensing the depth of his presence. "Mr. Jefferson," she said softly, "I want to understand your story, from your perspective." Malik's eyes met hers, calm but measured. He nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that he would share, but on his terms. Harrington watched the interaction, unease simmering beneath his rigid demeanor. He had assumed control of situations through authority and procedure, but here, both were failing him. Malik's calm strength, coupled with Eleanor's persistence, made Harrington confront the limits of his assumptions. The community outside had begun organizing. Groups of citizens and veteran advocates demanded not only Malik's release but recognition for the way he had been treated. Local churches, civic organizations, and neighborhood associations rallied together, creating a chorus of voices calling for justice. Social media amplified every detail, every document, every verified account of Malik's heroism. Vega quietly coordinated with Eleanor, making sure Malik's rights were fully protected while gathering information for internal reporting. She knew the situation had grown beyond routine protocol. The public attention had created both opportunity and danger. The wrong move could escalate tensions, but inaction was no longer an option. Harrington felt his world tilting. Every call, every comment, every post on social media chipped away at the rigid assumptions he had held. He had arrested a man he had dismissed without understanding, and the city was reminding him of the human cost of prejudice. For the first time, he wondered if his pride had blinded him, and if he would have the courage to face the consequences of his actions. Malik finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying authority. "I served my country. I protected lives. I survived the impossible, and yet, I am treated like I don't exist. Recognition matters, but justice matters more." His words resonated, piercing through the noise of the precinct and beyond. The audience feels both tension and inspiration. Malik's voice is steady, unwavering, a stark contrast to Harrington's uncertainty. Outside, support continues to grow. Protesters, community leaders, and ordinary citizens rally around Malik's story, demanding not just acknowledgement but systemic change. The city is erupting in reaction. Malik's heroism is fully recognized publicly, and Harrington faces the first true confrontation with his own prejudices, leaving viewers on edge. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Officers whispered, phones buzzed incessantly, and the hum of fluorescent lights no longer masked the tension. Harrington sat at his desk, papers untouched. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on him, a force stronger than any authority he had ever exercised. Sergeant Vega approached quietly, placing Malik's documents in front of Harrington. "They're asking questions," she said. Her voice was calm, but insistent. "The public wants answers. You need to recognize what's in front of you." Harrington stared at the documents, hesitant. Pride and fear warred inside him. He had always believed in law and order, in his authority. But now the truth demanded acknowledgement. Malik remained seated, silent yet commanding attention. Every movement, every glance, communicated patience and dignity. He understood the storm his story had ignited and the fragile tension between authority, justice, and societal perception. He had survived worse, but he also knew that the battles fought within systems and minds could be just as dangerous. Outside, Brooksville had become a stage. Protesters gathered near City Hall, carrying signs demanding recognition and justice. Veteran groups amplified the story, sharing Malik's heroism and highlighting the neglect he had endured. Social media erupted with support, outrage, and calls for systemic reform. The city was no longer passive. It was awake, questioning, and demanding accountability. Eleanor Whitman's follow-up articles provided depth, tracing Malik's military missions, the challenges he faced returning home, and the neglect that forced him into homelessness. She connected the dots between systemic failure, racial prejudice, and the personal courage of a man society had overlooked. Each article added fuel to the growing fire of public scrutiny. Harrington's colleagues began to distance themselves, wary of the attention and the implications. Some whispered criticisms, others expressed private doubts about his judgment. Harrington felt isolated, forced to confront the consequences of a worldview built on assumptions and privilege. Vega continued her quiet guidance. She approached Malik, ensuring he was comfortable and informed while subtly managing the rising tensions. Her instincts told her that Malik's story had the power to change not only public perception, but also the internal culture of the police department. Malik finally spoke, his words measured and deliberate. "I am not asking for pity. I am asking for justice, for acknowledgement, and for change. What I endured is a reflection of the system's failure, not my weakness." His statement carried weight, resonating far beyond the precinct. Harrington finally rose, his posture rigid but conflicted. He walked toward Malik, every step heavy with realization. I didn't see it," he admitted quietly, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Malik's eyes met his, calm but unyielding. Recognition had arrived, but accountability was still to be determined. The precinct phone rang incessantly, each call a reminder that the city and the media were watching. Harrington felt pressure mounting not from orders or rules, but from the undeniable weight of truth. The system had failed Malik, and he, a representative of that system, could no longer ignore it. Outside, the crowd grew, their voices demanding visibility for those often ignored. Eleanor continued reporting live, capturing every detail, every reaction, every moment of tension. Malik's story had transformed from a quiet injustice into a citywide reckoning, shining a light on both prejudice and heroism. People feels the tension build, Harrington's internal struggle, the public's rising outrage, and Malik's quiet resilience all converge. The city is alive, questioning, reacting, and demanding change. Malik, once invisible, now stands at the center of the storm, his dignity intact and his courage recognized. Public pressure escalates, Malik's heroism is undeniable, and Harrington faces the reality of his bias fully, leaving viewers eager for the coming confrontation and resolution. Inside the Brooksville Police Department, tension hung heavy like fog. Phones rang nonstop, journalists hovered near the entrance, and internal emails buzzed with complaints and inquiries. Commanders and officers were suddenly aware that the city, and the world, was scrutinizing their every move. The arrest of Malik Jefferson, now front-page news, had shattered the department's calm facade. Officer Daniel Harrington paced his small office, papers in hand, trying to organize his thoughts. His pride clashed with the growing awareness that he had misjudged Malik. Every time he glanced at the documents on his desk, the Bronze Star, commendations, and service records, a weight pressed on his chest. For years, he had relied on authority and assumptions. Now, the truth was undeniable, and he couldn't ignore it. Sergeant Rosa Vega moved through the department with quiet efficiency, managing both the internal fallout and Malik's ongoing case. She had anticipated some resistance, but the speed and intensity of the public reaction surprised even her. Officers whispered in corners, some defending Harrington, others questioning the decisions that led to the arrest. The department's image was fragile, and the media scrutiny threatened to crack it entirely. Malik, still detained, remained calm. He had endured chaos overseas and prejudice at home, and he understood the broader implications of the storm outside. He wasn't just a man in a holding cell, he was now a symbol of systemic neglect and resilience. Every moment of silence was deliberate, a demonstration that patience and dignity often spoke louder than anger or confrontation. Meanwhile, Eleanor Whitman continued her reporting. She visited the precinct, conducting interviews with those willing to speak off the record, capturing the emotional responses of officers and city officials alike. Her articles connected Malik's personal story to broader issues: racial bias, neglect of veterans, and the hidden struggles of the marginalized. The city's attention intensified with each post, each social media share, and each broadcast segment. Harrington's colleagues began to approach him cautiously. Some offered sympathetic words, others pointed criticism. "Daniel, people are watching. They want accountability," one officer whispered. Harrington nodded, feeling an unfamiliar vulnerability. Authority, once a shield, now felt like a weight pressing down on him. Vega finally spoke directly. "The city is demanding answers. You need to face the reality here. Ignoring it won't protect you or the department." Harrington swallowed hard. He had never admitted uncertainty so openly, yet Vega's calm insistence forced him to confront his bias. Outside, Cedar Lane became a hub of activity. Protesters, community leaders, and veteran advocates gathered to support Malik. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and voices chanted for recognition, fairness, and justice. The story had moved beyond news. It had become a movement, one that challenged both the department's actions and the city's conscience. Malik's presence in the precinct, once invisible to authority, now held power. Officers and administrators felt the impact of his story. It was no longer just about an arrest. It was about confronting the truth of prejudice, neglect, and overlooked heroism. Harrington finally stood before a mirror in his office, examining himself. The man staring back was a reflection of pride, authority, and assumptions, but also of blind spots and failures. For the first time, he questioned whether the career he had built on control had left him unable to see humanity when it mattered most. The precinct phones rang again. A city council member requested an immediate briefing, demanding to know why a decorated war hero had been arrested without consideration of his service. Harrington felt his stomach tighten. He knew the upcoming confrontation would expose not only his error in judgment, but the department's failure to recognize the humanity of those they served. The police department faces intense scrutiny. Harrington begins confronting the reality of his prejudice, and Malik's story has become a symbol that could reshape the city's perception of justice. Brooksville City Hall had never seen such a crowd. Outside the entrance, protesters waved signs, shouted slogans, and chanted Malik Jefferson's name. Social media streams broadcasted live, capturing every expression, every reaction, and every whispered conversation. The city was electrified, and everyone in the police department knew it. Inside, Harrington and Vega prepared for a public briefing. The atmosphere was tense. The pressure was palpable. Harrington's palms were clammy, his stomach twisted with nerves he hadn't felt in years. For all his training and authority, he was about to confront the reality of the arrest and its consequences in front of the city, the press, and his peers. Malik arrived, escorted quietly, his presence commanding attention without a single boast or gesture. He understood the gravity of the moment. Every eye on him was a reflection of years of neglect, prejudice, and assumptions. He carried himself with dignity, his past heroism now visible to a public that had ignored it for far too long. The press assembled quickly, cameras rolling, microphones poised. Eleanor Whitman positioned herself near the front, notebook ready, prepared to document every moment of accountability and confrontation. The air buzzed with anticipation, an electric mix of outrage, curiosity, and hope. Harrington began speaking, his voice firm but uneasy. "We are here to address the recent arrest of Mr. Malik Jefferson. It has come to our attention that his record and service were overlooked, and for that we acknowledge our failure." His words were measured, yet they carried the weight of realization, shame, and accountability. Malik listened quietly. His calmness contrasted sharply with the chaos outside, his dignity underscoring the gravity of the department's oversight. Every word Harrington spoke was a step toward recognition, but Malik's silence emphasized that acknowledgement alone could not erase systemic failure. Vega added context, presenting Malik's military record and describing the neglect and assumptions that led to the arrest. She spoke with precision, clarity, and moral authority, highlighting the consequences of bias, the importance of recognizing service, and the need for systemic change. The crowd outside reacted immediately. Cheers erupted for Malik, shouts called for accountability, and the weight of public scrutiny pressed in on Harrington. He felt the magnitude of the moment, realizing that this confrontation was about more than personal pride. It was about justice, recognition, and societal change. Eleanor's coverage broadcast live, showing Malik's calm presence, Harrington's tentative acknowledgement, and Vega's authoritative stance. Social media exploded with commentary, support, and debate. The city, long complacent, had awakened to a story that challenged assumptions, revealed prejudice, and celebrated courage. Harrington glanced at Malik, noting the quiet strength and unspoken resilience in his gaze. The officer's worldview had begun to shift, however slightly, as he recognized the humanity he had ignored. Malik's presence demanded accountability, forcing Harrington to confront his own biases in real time. Malik finally spoke, his voice measured, carrying authority and quiet power. "I served my country. I risked my life. I have faced challenges far greater than this moment. Recognition matters, but justice matters more. This is not just my story. It is the story of every individual overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated by a system that claims to protect them." People outside and online felt the weight of his words. The story had moved from individual injustice to societal reflection, exposing bias, neglect, and the need for recognition. Malik's quiet strength contrasted with Harrington's hesitant admission, highlighting the collision between prejudice and truth. Malik's confrontation in public forces Harrington to face the consequences of his assumptions. The city begins demanding systemic change, and the tension between justice, recognition, and societal bias reaches a critical point, leaving viewers eager to see the resolution. The story of Malik Jefferson had ignited Brooksville in ways no one anticipated. Social media feeds were flooded with his name, his photo, and his military record. Local news stations broadcast live segments on the arrest, the neglect of veterans, and the bias that had fueled assumptions about him. The city was awake, questioning, and demanding accountability. City council meetings became battlegrounds for discussion. Advocates, veterans, and ordinary citizens pressed for answers. "How can a decorated war hero be treated like a criminal?" one resident demanded. "Why are we ignoring those who served and sacrificed?" Others shared their own experiences of prejudice, poverty, and neglect, connecting their stories to Malik's struggle. Inside the precinct, Harrington felt the weight of public scrutiny intensify. Emails from superiors, calls from city officials, and whispered critiques from colleagues reminded him that the department's image, and his own reputation, was under attack. For years he had relied on control, assumptions, and authority, but now the world was forcing him to confront realities he had ignored. Sergeant Vega continued her quiet coordination. She ensured Malik's safety, facilitated interviews with Eleanor Whitman, and managed internal reporting. Her experience allowed her to navigate the turbulence, recognizing both the opportunity for reform and the danger of missteps. She understood that Malik's story was no longer just about him. It was a catalyst for change. Malik observed the chaos with measured patience. Every protester, every reporter, every social media post reminded him that recognition was not just personal, it was systemic. He remained calm, knowing that his heroism alone wouldn't change the system, but the awareness it sparked could be the first step. Eleanor's reporting highlighted the human side of the story. She interviewed veterans who had faced similar neglect, citizens outraged by bias, and advocates pressing for reform. Each piece emphasized the emotional contrast between heroism abroad and marginalization at home, making the audience confront uncomfortable truths about society, race, and recognition. Harrington tried to maintain composure, but the cracks in his confidence were evident. He began to see the consequences of assumptions and prejudice firsthand. Every public comment, every broadcast, every social media post chipped away at his certainty. For the first time, he felt vulnerable not through external danger, but through the undeniable truth of his own oversight. Vega approached him quietly. "Daniel, this isn't just about public opinion, it's about justice. You need to understand that." Harrington nodded, silently acknowledging the weight of her words. Recognition and accountability were no longer abstract. They were immediate, personal, and inescapable. Outside, the crowd continued to swell. Cedar Lane, once a neglected stretch of the city, had become a hub for advocacy and reflection. Residents, veterans, and activists rallied together, demanding systemic reform and visibility for those often overlooked. Malik's presence became a symbol of courage, patience, and resilience in the face of systemic failure. The tension reached a tipping point when the first calls for internal investigation were made. City officials demanded a full review of the arrest, questioning not only Harrington's actions but the policies and assumptions that allowed the oversight. The department faced pressure on multiple fronts: media, public, and internal, creating a climate where accountability was inevitable. Public pressure mounts, the city demands systemic change, and Harrington faces the first real consequences of his assumptions, leaving viewers eager to see how justice and recognition will unfold. Harrington's personal world began to unravel. Calls from family, friends, and colleagues questioned his judgment. Internal Affairs opened an inquiry, examining not only the arrest of Malik Jefferson, but the broader culture of assumptions that pervaded the department. For a man who had spent years building authority through control, the experience was jarring. Malik remained calm, observing the shift in energy. He had endured danger, loss, and neglect in ways Harrington could not fathom. But he understood the significance of this moment, not as a personal victory, but as a test of accountability, recognition, and societal reflection. Every reaction, every decision, was now amplified by the public eye. Sergeant Vega coordinated with city officials to ensure Malik's story was represented accurately. She maintained his dignity while navigating political pressures, media scrutiny, and departmental tension. Her calm efficiency contrasted with the growing chaos surrounding Harrington, highlighting the disparity between measured action and reactive defensiveness. Eleanor Whitman published another article, emphasizing Harrington's growing awareness of bias and the department's responsibility for systemic neglect. Her narrative framed Malik as both hero and catalyst, a man whose dignity demanded recognition and whose story exposed uncomfortable truths. The article was widely shared, sparking debates and discussions across the city. Harrington struggled with private guilt. He replayed the arrest in his mind, recognizing every moment of assumption, prejudice, and oversight. For the first time, he felt the human cost of his worldview. It was not abstract. It was personal. Every hesitation, every misjudgment, every unconsidered assumption had consequences, and Malik's calm resilience now confronted him with the undeniable reality. The public response intensified. Advocates demanded meetings, media outlets requested interviews, and social platforms amplified voices calling for reform. Harrington faced the full weight of accountability, realizing that acknowledgement alone would not suffice. He needed action, reflection, and change. Malik's presence remained unwavering. He did not gloat, complain, or demand attention. He simply observed, letting his dignity and calm strength speak for themselves. His life had been marked by courage, resilience, and survival. Now, his story was reshaping the city's understanding of heroism, prejudice, and justice. Vega approached Harrington with a quiet directive. "You have a choice," she said. "You can continue to cling to assumptions, or you can confront them and help repair what's broken." Harrington nodded slowly, understanding that inaction was no longer an option. Every moment of hesitation allowed systemic failure to persist. The department scheduled a press conference. Harrington, once confident in his authority, now faced the city with vulnerability, acknowledgement, and the necessity of action. Malik's story had forced him to confront his biases, not just publicly, but internally. The collision between truth and prejudice was now unavoidable. Outside, Cedar Lane remained a hub of activity. Citizens, veterans, and activists continued to rally, demanding visibility, justice, and systemic change. Malik's story had transformed from a single arrest into a citywide reckoning. The crowd's energy pressed on the precinct, amplifying the urgency for accountability and reform. Harrington is forced to confront the personal consequences of his assumptions. Malik's story continues to inspire and challenge the city, and systemic accountability looms, leaving viewers anxious to see how justice and recognition will fully unfold. The press conference was scheduled for late morning. By 8 a.m., the Brooksville Police Department was buzzing with tension. Officers whispered in corners, some uneasy, others defensive. Reporters set up cameras, adjusted microphones, and positioned themselves to capture every detail of what promised to be a defining moment. Malik Jefferson arrived, escorted by Sergeant Vega. His presence was quiet yet commanding, radiating dignity and resilience. He did not raise his voice, he did not posture. But his calm strength alone demanded attention, drawing every eye toward him. Crowds outside and cameras inside focused on him, the hero who had been ignored, dismissed, and now celebrated. Officer Daniel Harrington prepared to speak. His chest tightened with nerves he had never felt in uniform. Pride and fear waged war inside him. This was no routine briefing. This was accountability in real time, with the city, media, and his own conscience scrutinizing every word. Harrington began with hesitation. "We are here to address the arrest of Mr. Malik Jefferson," he said. His voice wavered slightly, betraying the conflict within. "It has come to light that I misjudged him, that assumptions I made were wrong, and that the department failed to recognize his service and sacrifice." Murmurs rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Outside, the crowd sensed the tension and intensified their support for Malik. Whistles blew, chants echoed, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Malik's eyes met Harrington's. There was no anger, only a piercing calm that silently demanded acknowledgement. "Recognition alone is not enough," Malik said, his voice steady and controlled. "Justice must follow. Accountability must follow. My story is not unique. There are countless others who suffer in silence, unseen and unheard." Harrington swallowed hard, feeling the weight of truth pressing down on him. He had assumed control, authority, and judgment were enough, but they weren't. The calm dignity of a man he had once dismissed forced him to confront not just his mistake, but the systemic prejudice it represented. Sergeant Vega stepped forward, presenting verified documents, records of commendations, and corroborating statements from veterans and city officials. "This is not just Malik Jefferson's story," she said. "It is a reflection of a system that overlooks heroism, neglects those who serve, and allows bias to cloud judgment." The media captured every moment. Cameras zoomed in on Harrington's faltering confidence, Malik's quiet authority, and Vega's firm resolve. Social media streams erupted as live coverage shared the confrontation with viewers across the city and beyond. Harrington tried to respond, to regain some semblance of authority. "I take full responsibility," he admitted. "I failed to see beyond my assumptions. I will work to ensure this does not happen again." His words were sincere, heavy with the realization that recognition without action was meaningless. The public outside responded immediately, their cheers mingling with chants for justice and accountability. Citizens recognized not only Malik's heroism, but also the courage it took for Harrington to acknowledge his error. The collision of truth and pride was unfolding for all to see. Malik remained calm. He knew that change was slow and difficult. A single acknowledgement, no matter how sincere, was only the beginning. But the moment marked a shift, a crack in the wall of prejudice, an opportunity for justice, and a platform for recognition of those too often overlooked. Harrington publicly acknowledges his failure. Malik challenges the city for systemic justice. People are waiting to see whether the department and the community will act or remain stagnant. The energy in Brooksville was electric. Malik Jefferson's story had shifted from local news to citywide conversation, and the consequences were undeniable. Social media platforms buzzed with discussion, analysis, and calls for action. Citizens were engaged, activists mobilized, and veteran organizations amplified every detail of Malik's service and subsequent neglect. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was heavy but purposeful. Harrington had been instructed to attend multiple meetings with internal affairs, city officials, and community leaders. Each conversation emphasized accountability, reform, and the need to prevent future incidents. For the first time, he understood the depth of responsibility that came with authority. Sergeant Vega monitored each interaction carefully. She guided Malik's involvement, ensuring that his voice was heard while protecting him from exploitation. She had learned to navigate both institutional bureaucracy and public scrutiny, recognizing the fragile balance between influence and overexposure. Malik's focus was clear: visibility and change. He participated in interviews, public forums, and community discussions with deliberate calm. Every word he spoke highlighted the systemic issues faced by marginalized individuals and veterans. Every anecdote, every factual account of his service, reinforced the emotional weight of the story. Harrington, meanwhile, struggled with internal conflict. Pride and past assumptions clashed with the undeniable truth he had witnessed. He had been forced to see a man he had dismissed not as a threat, but as a hero. Each acknowledgement, each meeting, chipped away at the barriers he had built around himself. The public response grew louder. Citizens demanded departmental reform, better support for veterans, and accountability for officers who acted on prejudice. Community leaders organized panels, town hall meetings, and campaigns to address systemic neglect. Malik's story had become a catalyst, and Brooksville was responding with urgency. Eleanor Whitman continued her coverage, documenting the evolution of public opinion, Harrington's gradual acknowledgement, and Malik's patient resilience. Her reporting emphasized both the human and systemic aspects of the story, creating emotional engagement that resonated across demographics. Harrington eventually met with Malik privately, a rare moment away from cameras and crowds. I cannot undo what I did," Harrington admitted. "But I want to learn. I want to make things right." Malik looked at him, calm yet piercing, and said, "Acknowledgement is the first step. Action is what matters next. Your choices now will define more than just you. They will define how the system treats people like me." Vega observed from nearby, recognizing the significance of the interaction. The confrontation had shifted from accusation to potential collaboration. The narrative was no longer simply about injustice, it was about transformation, accountability, and hope. The city began to mobilize tangible support for Malik. Local businesses, veterans organizations, and social advocacy groups offered resources, recognition ceremonies, and assistance. Public acknowledgement turned into actionable support, reflecting the emotional and societal impact of the story. As the day closed, Malik walked through Cedar Lane, unnoticed by many, yet carrying the weight of recognition and responsibility. He had survived battlefields abroad and prejudice at home, and now he was navigating the complexities of public visibility and systemic change. Each step was deliberate, a balance between humility, resilience, and leadership. Malik's heroism begins reshaping the city's response to systemic neglect. Harrington's journey toward accountability is underway, and the stage is set for the ultimate resolution of both personal and societal conflict. The city of Brooksville had reached a tipping point. Malik Jefferson's story was no longer a local headline. It had become a symbol of accountability, racial bias, and the neglected struggles of veterans. Crowds gathered outside the precinct and City Hall, holding signs demanding recognition and reform. The air buzzed with chants, conversations, and cameras capturing every reaction. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Harrington had been called into multiple meetings with internal affairs, the city council, and legal advisors. Each session peeled away layers of denial and defensiveness, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths. He had misjudged Malik, dismissed his humanity, and acted on bias, but the exposure of these actions left no room for evasion. Sergeant Vega coordinated quietly, balancing the public demand for justice with the practicalities of departmental procedures. She ensured Malik's voice remained central while mitigating potential exploitation or sensationalism. Her experience allowed her to navigate the delicate line between public outrage and constructive action. Malik, for his part, remained calm but vigilant. His dignity and measured presence contrasted with the chaos outside, commanding attention without a single word of boastfulness. He understood that his story carried power to inspire, to challenge assumptions, and to demand change, but also responsibility. Every action now had consequences both for him and the city. Eleanor Whitman continued documenting every moment, capturing Harrington's growing awareness, Malik's quiet authority, and the city's response. Her reporting emphasized the emotional journey, highlighting the contrast between neglected heroism and systemic failure, which resonated deeply with viewers and readers alike. Harrington finally addressed Malik directly in a private meeting. "I want to make this right," he admitted, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I cannot undo my mistakes, but I can act differently. I need to understand how to serve people like you with respect and fairness." Malik's gaze held a mixture of acknowledgement and expectation. "Action is what matters," he said. "Your choices now will define whether this story leads to lasting change or fades into another forgotten injustice." Outside, the city's response intensified. Activists, veterans, and community members held public forums and discussions, demanding systemic reforms and accountability for all officers. Malik's story was not just about one arrest. It had become the spark for a broader movement advocating racial equity, veterans' rights, and social responsibility. The tension in the precinct reached a breaking point when the first internal recommendations were made. Harrington would face disciplinary measures, sensitivity and bias training, and community service alongside Malik's advocacy initiatives. The recommendations were both punitive and transformative, emphasizing personal accountability while fostering systemic change. Malik watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Recognition alone had never been his goal. He wanted change, action, and accountability. Every decision now, every acknowledgement of bias and neglect, was a step toward systemic reform. The city's media captured Harrington's first public statement. "I acted on assumptions. I ignored the humanity before me. I am accountable for my actions and committed to learning and change." His words were met with mixed reactions, but the fact that he spoke openly, without deflection, signaled a turning point. The city is demanding systemic reform, Harrington's accountability is underway, and Malik's story has become a symbol of both heroism and societal change, leaving viewers eager for the final resolution and emotional closure. Brooksville began to breathe differently. Malik Jefferson's story had left an indelible mark on the city, inspiring both immediate action and long-term reflection. Community leaders, veteran advocates, and ordinary citizens worked together to implement reforms, ensuring that systemic neglect and prejudice would not go unchecked again. Inside the precinct, Harrington continued his journey of transformation. Bias training, public service, and community engagement challenged his assumptions daily. For the first time, he understood that authority was not about control. It was about responsibility, empathy, and service. The lessons were hard-earned, but he approached them with sincerity and determination. Malik's life began to change too, not because of public recognition, but because systemic support finally arrived. Social programs, veteran assistance, and community advocacy provided the stability he had been denied for years. He continued to live simply, with dignity and purpose, now serving as a mentor and advocate for others facing similar struggles. Sergeant Vega remained a steadfast presence, ensuring Malik's story maintained its integrity and impact. She facilitated meetings, helped implement community programs, and guided Harrington and others through the process of understanding and accountability. Her moral compass had helped anchor the storm, turning chaos into constructive change. Eleanor Whitman published the final feature in the series, a deep dive into Malik's journey, his military service, the arrest, and the aftermath. The article highlighted the emotional, societal, and systemic dimensions of the story, resonating widely with readers and viewers. The narrative was emotional, gripping, and reflective, demonstrating the power of storytelling to provoke change. The city held a recognition ceremony for Malik. Local officials, veterans, community members, and the press gathered to honor his service, acknowledge past neglect, and celebrate resilience. Malik accepted the recognition with quiet humility, emphasizing that the moment was about systemic awareness, not personal accolades. Harrington attended the ceremony, visibly changed. He approached Malik, extending a hand not in authority, but in respect. "I am sorry," he said simply. Malik nodded, accepting the gesture without bitterness. The reconciliation was not about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and committing to better action moving forward. Outside, Brooksville began to see tangible change. Veteran support programs expanded, community oversight increased, and initiatives addressing racial bias and systemic neglect were implemented. Malik's story had transformed from personal struggle into a catalyst for civic and societal awareness. As the sun set over Cedar Lane, Malik walked quietly through the neighborhood he had once called home, now transformed by attention, support, and community engagement. He paused briefly, observing the city, the people, and the change his story had ignited. The streets that had once symbolized neglect now reflected recognition, resilience, and hope. Malik's heroism had been acknowledged, systemic change had begun, and both personal and societal transformation were underway. The story concluded with the emotional and moral impact of courage, dignity, and accountability, leaving viewers inspired, reflective, and eager to share the story. Malik's journey from neglect to recognition is complete. Harrington's transformation demonstrates accountability and growth, and the city is forever changed by a story that challenged assumptions, inspired action, and celebrated human dignity. If this is your first time on Top Core, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you don't want to miss stories that reveal the hidden truths no one talks about.